Chapter 40 is where we're going to really end up today, but I thought it was fascinating. It's fun sometimes when I'm teaching out of one area of the Bible, Ezekiel in this case, but I do my own reading in another part, and in your mind you start to draw connections and see things that you just never quite occurred to me before. And I've been reading through the end of Deuteronomy. And it's fascinating to see. Deuteronomy, of course, is the book where God renews his contract with the children of Israel. God has brought them out of Egypt, and they wandered around, did the Sinai thing and all that. They get to the Jordan River and look across. They send spies into the land. And, of course, you know what the people say. They say, oh, no, it's too scary. We can't go in. They're bigger than us. They'll beat us. They'll defeat us. And all of our poor little children will be orphans and killed and stuff. And God says, all right, you're going back into the wilderness for 40 years until all the adults who voted no are dead. And then those precious little children that you were so concerned about will be grown up, and they will get to enter the land. And so they wander around, and of course all the adults die. The kids come back. They're ready to enter into the land. And God reintroduces the law to them. He rewrites the contract for the next generation. And that's what we call Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law. But it's fascinating to me to see some of the things that God said in Deuteronomy as demonstrating that he knew full well exactly how Israel would disobey him, how they'd be sent into captivity, and how he'd have to restore them. And the things that he says back in Deuteronomy are exactly what we're studying as real time in Ezekiel. In other words, he prophesied or predicted exactly in Deuteronomy what he said in Ezekiel. Listen to this out of Deuteronomy chapter 29. You don't have to turn there, but I can read it to you, and you can follow along if you want. Deuteronomy 29:18, beware lest there be among you a man or woman or clan or tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations. That would be the nations they're taking over. Beware lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit, one who, when he hears the words of this sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall be safe, though I walk in the stubbornness of my own heart. In other words, I can do whatever I want, but God doesn't see, and I can get away with it, and I'll be okay. Does that sound exactly like what the children of Israel were saying in Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel? That's exactly what they said. He continues, this will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him, but rather the anger of the Lord and his jealousy will smoke against that man, and the curses written in this book will settle upon him, and the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven. In other words, all the curses given in the previous couple chapters for disobedience will start taking place. And sure enough, we know that's exactly what happened. Verse 21, and the Lord will single him out from all the tribes of Israel for calamity in accordance with all the curses of the covenant written in the book of this law. And the next generation, your children who will rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes from a far land will say, when they see the afflictions of the land and the sickness with which the Lord has made it sick, the whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown, nothing growing, where no plant can sprout, an overthrow like that of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and wrath. And all the nations will say, why has the Lord done this to the land? And what caused the heat of his great anger? And then the people will say, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, and went over and served other gods and worshipped them, gods who they had known or he had not allotted to them. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land, bringing upon it all the curses written in this book. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger and fury and great wrath, and cast them into another land as they are to this day. And sure enough, again from Ezekiel, I think it was last week where we just read, where the people, the foreign nations, look at the Israelites who were exiled out and all the calamity and catastrophe that happened to Israel. Remember, and they looked at the exiles and they said, what? They said really exactly this. What in the world happened to you guys? What did you do to deserve all this stuff? And initially they said, remember, boy, your God must not be very good. But eventually they come around and say, well, it's because you disobeyed God and you didn't follow what he said, and that's why all this happened to you. And that's exactly what God had predicted clear back in Deuteronomy. But he doesn't stop there. He continues in chapter 30, the first few verses. But, he says, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I've set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you. In other words, when you've been exiled and all these curses and judgments have come upon you, and you think back and you remember all those things. Verse 2, and return to the Lord your God you and your children, and obey his voice and all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. After you've been exiled, but you finally turn your heart back to him and worship him, then God's going to reach out and he's going to grab you from all the distant places where he sent you and bring you back to the land. That is exactly what Ezekiel's been talking about last week and this week and next week in our lessons, the restoration and regathering of Israel. Verse 4, if your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, he's exaggerating, obviously they're going to be on earth, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And the Lord will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. Remember, we had the two mountains, and we talked about the prosperity that God would bring to Israel and how he's going to bless the populations and the fruit trees and the cattle and the land and all the things. He said, I'll give you more blessing than I even ever did your fathers, and it'll be such a wonderful, amazing time. That's exactly what he said here clear back in Deuteronomy 30. He continues, and the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes and the enemies who persecuted you. Everything I'm punishing you with right now, I will give even more so to all of your enemies. Again, you remember what happened last week in last week's Ezekiel lesson, where God put the hooks in the jaws of the people, and he dragged them over to Israel for confrontation, and he destroyed them. Verse 8, and you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep all of his commandments that I command you today. The Lord your God will make you abundantly prosperous in all the work of your hand, in the fruit of your womb, and the fruit of your cattle, and the fruit of your ground. For the Lord will again delight in prospering you, as he took delight in your fathers, when you obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes that are written in this book of the law, when you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. All the things that God told Moses clear back at this time, about, I think there's roughly 1500 BC, I looked it up last night. So many hundreds of years prior, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened to the Israelites. They disobeyed, they turned to idolatry, they adopted the gods of the foreign nations. God had to punish them. He ultimately had to exile them. The people looked at him, they said, what happened to you? It's because you disobeyed. And someday, we're still looking forward to when the hearts of the Jewish people turn back to him and worship him with all their hearts, and he regathers them, and God punishes the foes, and he regrows all of, he makes Israel prosperous again, which they're already pretty prosperous, but in that day it'll be way more, and it'll be fantastic. All the things that God predicted, and that's exactly what we see in Ezekiel. So throughout the first several portions of the book of Ezekiel, he is talking about the condemnation and the judgments coming from God. But now once Jerusalem has fallen and everything that Ezekiel said had come true, God turns his focus on encouraging the people and reminding them of the restoration that he also promised, along with the curses, back in the covenant that they broke, Deuteronomy. And all this is coming to pass because they broke the covenant that God made with them originally. And all God is doing throughout the book of Ezekiel is fulfilling the covenant he made with them. If you obey, I'll prosper you. If you disobey, I will have to curse and punish you. And all he's doing is fulfilling the covenant. That's all he's doing. So we're in chapters 40 through 44, and we get to quite a passage here. Chapter 40, verses 1 through 4. In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, the 14th year after the city was struck down, so 14 years since the city was destroyed. On that very day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me to the city. In visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel, and set me down on a very high mountain, on which was a structure like a city to the south. And when he brought me there, behold, there was a man whose appearance was like bronze, with a linen cord and a measuring reed in his hand, and he was standing in the gateway. And the man said to me, Son of man, look with your eyes, and hear with your ears, and set your heart upon all that I shall show you. For you were brought here in order that I might show it to you. Declare all that you see to the house of Israel. And God gives Ezekiel another vision, and in this vision he transports Ezekiel from the Babylonian area where he was. If you remember that map we showed you a couple hundred miles away, And he takes him in this vision back to the land of Israel. And he looks, and he's standing on top of this hill, and he sees, it says, a structure like a city. And God takes him to this structure. Now, we know this is just a vision because at the time Ezekiel was prophesying, if he were actually standing on that mountain, he would look and see what? He would see a landfill, a smoldering landfill full of trash, because that's what was left of Israel. But at that time in the vision, he looks, and there's a city. He brought him there, verse 3, he brought me, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like bronze, probably an angel, of course, we believe, my opinion anyway, with a linen cord and a measuring reed. And he said, look and pay attention to everything I'm going to show you, down to the last detail. Get out your writing pen, get your typing fingers ready, get your voice recorder going and your camcorder. You're going to want to take down all of these details, write everything down. I don't know if it's relevant or not, but my mind popped into like some of John's revelations and stuff, where God said, seal this up, don't write this down, and don't disclose this part yet to the people, because it's not time for that yet. And that's the opposite of what he tells Ezekiel here. He says, Ezekiel, you write everything down. Tell this to all the people. So Ezekiel was taken away in a vision to Israel's Temple Mount and given a very detailed description of that temple that he sees. And what follows are some extensive details, including the terms of measurement, in terms of measurement and layout. Why does God instruct Ezekiel to include all of this information? And I don't know if anybody's read ahead through today's passage or what you thought today's passage would be, but the next couple chapters, verses 40 through 42, chapters 40 through 42 really is where it is. And it's just a really, really extended passage of measurements and dimensions and descriptions and orientations. It's an architect's dream and a regular guy's nightmare to try to read through. Because I don't know, maybe you're way smarter than I am, but I have a really hard time following all this. And you start reading a few verses in, and you try to picture what's going on, and you read another verse, and you start to get lost, and you read another verse, and you say, whoa, what just happened? And pretty soon you're just kind of lost in a sea of measurements and numbers and dimensions and descriptions and all this stuff. And you think, why? And this is important, apparently, because God, through the angel, he says, Ezekiel, this is very important. Get every detail that I'm showing you. So he's not just like giving him the grand, the nickel tour or whatever it is. Here's the kitchen, and here's the dining room, and here's the bedrooms, and here's the living room. He's giving dimensions, exact measurements of everything. I mean, I could pick any one of these verses, and we get lost pretty quick. Verse 6 of chapter 40. The side rooms, 1 reed long, 1 reed broad. The space between the side rooms, 5 cubits. The threshold of the gate by the vestibule of the gate on the inner end, 1 reed. Then he measured the vestibule and the gateway on the inside, 1 reed. And then he measured the vestibule of the gateway, 8 cubits. Its jambs, 2 cubits. Vestibule of the gate was in the inner end, 3 side rooms on the either side of the east gate. And it goes on and on and on and on, measurement after measurement. What is the deal? Why all the detail? And that's where I'm left. So I think this morning we're going to go through these spiritual applications of every last measurement that the angel took. Whew, I'm glad you're laughing. Yes, we're not going to do that. First of all, that'd be way too much. B, I'd get lost. And C, I'm not sure that's how we're supposed to read this passage. I'm not sure we're supposed to allegorize every single measurement of every single room and count every single brick on every single wall. I don't think that's the point of the passage. So what is the point of the passage? Why would God have Ezekiel record all these things in these very lengthy and confusing 3 chapters? I came up with 3 reasons. One, I'll call maybe, I don't know if it's lesser or not. Reason number 1, remember who he's writing to and remember the situation. Put this passage into context of the book. What is Ezekiel trying to do here? He's speaking to exiles who have lost everything. They're in absolute discouragement is an understatement, right? They're destitute. They're homeless. They know they've lost everything, their culture, their country, their family, their city. Everything is gone. They have nothing to look forward to. They're absolutely hopeless. And so God comes down to Ezekiel, and he says, Ezekiel, I want you to remind them again that this is not the end of the line for Israel and their family and their legacy. I will someday restore them, and I don't want this to be just a generalized encouragement. I don't want this to turn into some hypothetical fairy tale. I want you to let them know that this is absolutely very concrete, and I'm going to show them how specific and concrete this is by giving you the exact dimensional measurements of this temple that someday will be. So number 1 is an encouragement to the exiles who had lost everything. It's a graphic, detailed picture of something that they could look forward to. And Ezekiel does give enough detail and information here that you can actually build a scale model, or hypothetically a full-scale model someday, of this temple. And the people could picture this, and they could understand that God has actually written up the blueprints already for what he someday will build. And if you're the exile who, again, has lost everything and you need something to look forward to and some kind of encouragement, this is a pretty good way to do it. I guess it'd be like if our church burned down and we didn't know what to do, and some prophet came to us and said, "Don't worry, the church will be okay, and you'll all get to meet together again, and God will bring you back together." And so he shows you pictures and blueprints of the actual church that you'll get to meet in. It's kind of like that, but even more so. So reason number one, I figured that why God would put all this in here, an encouragement to the exiles. And again, that comes from the context of the rest of the book and imagining who Ezekiel was preaching to and how this would affect them. And I think that's completely reasonable. Another reason I think he might have done this and given Ezekiel all these painstaking detail is that these literal blueprints for the construction of the future temple that is what he gave. So at that time, God is starting to talk about how someday he will reinstitute the Jewish way of life. And I'll explain more what I mean about that a little bit later on, but we'll kind of introduce it right here. As you read through this passage and all the description of how to construct the temple, and again, the dimensions and layout of everything, it kind of reminds us of another passage way back in the Old Testament, way back when, as I said earlier, when God is writing the law and giving it to Moses. And part of what God gave Moses as he was introducing himself to the people after he brought them out of Egypt and showed them his mighty wonders and signs and miracles, and the Red Sea thing happens, and the Mount Sinai and the voice and the Ten Commandments and all that stuff happens. And they're walking through the wilderness with Moses, and God has introduced himself, and he gives Moses instructions as he's setting up and orchestrating his nation and his people, and he's starting to tell them how he wishes or how he commands to be worshipped. And he gives Moses a whole bunch of instructions on how to construct what? The tabernacle. Yeah. And God says, all right, I'm going to go into a lot of detail here, a lot of very specific instructions, construction material, dimensions, how and who everything is going to be constructed by and how they're going to do it. And again, we see chapters and chapters of painstaking instructions specifically on how to set up the tabernacle so that the people may properly worship him. And God is very particular about how he is worshipped. And the first time around, like I said in Exodus, specifically chapters 25 to 30 in there, if you want to cross-reference, you can. But it's kind of a fun comparison. Again, for me anyway, not so much in every specific detail because that just overwhelms my brain and it tends to blow up. But the list of details that he gives in each passage and the comparison. The first time, he's introducing himself to his people. And he says, this is how I wish to be worshipped. This is the tabernacle, the building, the settings in which you are to worship me. And here's how you're to conduct yourself. And here's the furniture that's to go in it. And here are the materials you're supposed to make everything out of. But I'm very particular about how I'm to be worshipped. You don't get to just do whatever you want and make up in your own mind how I'm to be worshipped and what I'm like and what I require. I am telling you how to worship me. You don't tell you how to worship me because I am the holy God and I'm in charge. And he instills a sense of reverence and awe and worship and respect between God and the people because the people see he is in charge and we are to do as he says, and he is holy and he's separate from us. And you can see that in the design of the tabernacle, the outer court, the inner court, and the Holy of Holies, and all that stuff, and different levels of access that different people have to what. And the general joke, you public Israelite can't just walk into the Holy of Holies and say, hey, God, how are you? It doesn't work that way because God is holy and he's to be revered. And all these things we learn from what Moses set up in the tabernacle. And lo and behold, do you know what God promises someday he will do in the future? To a people who have forgotten about him and turned away for millennia, for thousands of years. But someday, you know what God does to his people? He reaches out and he grabs them and he brings them back to himself. And he starts to do all over again the same exact thing that he did clear back in Moses' day. He reintroduces himself to the people, and he reinstitutes this sanctuary, this temple where he is to be worshipped. Again, they don't just get to worship him however they want. He decides how the layout is, and he decides the dimensions of every detail, and he decides who gets to go where, and he decides how he is to be worshipped, because again, he is holy and separate from the people, and the people don't get to just do whatever they want. He is the God, and he is to be worshipped in the way that he sees fit. And the same thing he did back in Moses' day, he does in the future all over again to reintroduce himself to his people after being, I'll put it in quotes, gone, although we know he's not gone, but after setting them aside for thousands of years, and he reinstitutes his relationship with them. That's reason number 2. That brings us, for a moment, we're going to give you reason number 3 here in just a minute. But that kind of brings us to chapter 43. Chapter 43 turns our attention away from the details of the temple, and something really amazing happens. In fact, if you remember earlier in the book, clear back in chapter 10 of Ezekiel, I said I think Ezekiel chapter 10 and parts of 11 are probably the saddest chapters, definitely in all of Ezekiel, maybe in all of the Old Testament, because it's when God leaves his people. And God had set up his residence in the temple. Remember, Solomon had dedicated it, and God's glory came down and shined in the temple, so much so that nobody could be in there, and the smoke filled the temple, and everybody's worshiping and praying and offering sacrifices, and it's a great time because God has come down to live with his people, and they were his people, and he was their God, and if the people would obey and follow him, everything would be fantastic because God is living with the people. And that's something, again, that it's mind-blowing to even think of, where God would choose out a people and say, I want to live with you, like right next door to you, literally right next door in your city, and I want to be here with you. But the years go by, and the people, they disobey. And again, if you can remember back to chapters 9 and 10 and 11, where God takes Ezekiel in this vision back to the temple, and they take a look around, and remember what they see. They walk in the door, and here's a pagan ceremony going on over in this corner, and here's a shrine over here by that wall, and he kind of burrows through the wall, and there's all the elders and the leaders, and they're worshiping their idolatrous carvings on the walls over here, and another Asherah pole over there. And God's whole temple is polluted and idolatrous, and they've turned away, and they're worshiping the sun in front of the main altar, and all kinds of unbelievable nastiness going on. And God looks around, and he says what to Ezekiel? He says, I can't live here anymore. You've messed up my home so badly. I can't do it. You're too wicked. You're too idolatrous. You don't care about me. You're making a mockery of my temple. And just a couple short years, roughly, before the temple is destroyed, God says, I got to move out. And this place that has been my home for quite some time now, where I've lived in the Holy of Holies above the ark, and the cherubim and the mercy seat and all, I can't do it anymore. There's nothing holy about this place. And he gets up and he walks outside and he hops on his big chariot thing that we saw, the angels and the wheels and all the throne on top and all that stuff. I showed you a picture of it. He says, I got to get out of here. And he hops on his throne and he leaves. He crosses the threshold of the temple and he goes out the gate of the city out to the east, and off he goes off of the Mount of Olives. And God has left the city. And what was once God's glorious temple and his home is now nothing more than a big empty building. There's nothing left, because without God there, it's just another big building, and it's empty. And sure enough, a couple short years later, the Babylonians come in and they wipe it out and they destroy it, and that's the end of it. But if you can remember all that back then, take a look at chapter 43. Chapter 43, verse 1. Then he led me in this vision that Ezekiel's on. He led me to the gate facing east. Again, if you can remember chapters 10 and 11, gate facing east, that sounds a little bit familiar because that's where God left through. So he stands by this gate, but look what happens in verse 2. Behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east. That's the same direction he left in. And Ezekiel looks out through the gate, and here comes this vision, something on the horizon, and it's really bright, and it's getting closer, and it touches down on the Mount of Olives. And I see somebody back here who's just at the Mount of Olives and stuff, right? So you can picture all this. I'm a little bit jealous here. Can you do that if there's an east gate? You can just kind of look out across the valley, and there it is. Okay, she's nodding her head, yes. Thank you, I appreciate that. There's the Mount of Olives. Boom, something happens on the mount, and this bright thing is coming towards me across the valley, and it comes up through the east gate. Behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east, and the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city, just like the vision that I had seen by the Kebar Canal. Remember what vision that is? The whole mobile throne chariot thing? Again, the the angels underneath and the wheels and the throne on top and the big flat plane there and the rainbows and all the stuff. That's what's coming back again. So this is the third time he's seen this glory of God vision, and it's the same one. And in verse 3, and I fell on my face, and the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. He's back home again after so many thousands of years of being gone. After we drove him out of his home, now he's rebuilt this new temple, and God has come back to live with the people again. And this temple is not polluted, and this temple is not idolatrous, and the people are worshiping him, and God says, yes, I can finally come back home and be with my people. And he comes storming in through that same east gate that he left through, and he sits down, and he's back at home in his throne with the people again. Continue in verse 6. And while the man was standing beside me, I heard one speaking to me out of the temple, and he said, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. And the house of Israel shall no more defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their whorings and the dead bodies of their kings and their high places, by setting their threshold by my threshold, and their doorpost beside my doorpost, all those little idol shanties that they set up around the temple. That's not going to happen anymore. With only a wall between me and them, they have defiled my holy name by their abominations that they have committed. So I have consumed them in my anger. Now let them put away their whoring and the dead bodies of their kings far from me, and I will dwell in their midst forever. And as for you, son of man, describe to the house of Israel of the temple, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, that they shall measure the plan. Did you catch that verse? Let me read that verse one more time. This is verse 10 of chapter 43. As for you, son of man, describe to the house of Israel, to the people you're speaking to, describe to them the temple. Why? That they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and they shall measure the plan. And if they are ashamed of all that they have done, and make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangement, its exits, its entrances, that is, its whole design, and make known to them as well its statutes and its whole design and all its laws, and write it down in their sight, so they may observe all its laws and its statutes and carry them out. This is the law of the temple. The whole territory on the top of the mountain all around shall be most holy. Behold, this is the law of the temple. And so we can see here how God has come back to his people, and he's sitting there, and there's the temple, and God is living in it. And this is what all the people are longing for. But he gives a reason for why he gives all those details right here in this passage that we read. And this is reason number 3. Oh, sorry, I always forget to click sometimes. There's the map of God returning to his people. You see the little glory thing there on top of the mountain, and he comes back into the city. Okay. If you're wondering, I did copy and paste that from my previous lesson, but I just flipped around the blue arrow because the exact opposite thing is happening. Okay. There we go. But here's reason number 3 why I believe God has given Ezekiel all these plans. God's glory and his return to his temple is motivation for the people to turn from idolatry and follow the true God. And right in this passage, God said, give the people the details of this plan so that they will realize that the whole reason I had to leave was because of their own idolatry that drove me out in the first place. And they're the reason I had to leave, because they messed things up and their abominations and their idolatries and all this stuff. But someday, when I come back, and I will rebuild this temple once again, and I will move back in, and I will be your God, and you will be my people, and we'll live together the way that things should have been all along, had you only obeyed. But at that time, you will obey me, and I will never, ever have to leave again. Isn't that great? Isn't that exciting? I mean, that's exciting to us, I think, and we are not the Jewish people, and we are not one of the 12 tribes, and we're not the people that God will gather in from all the lands. This is their heritage, and this is their possession. But it even excites us at a time when God would restore his rule and reign in Jerusalem, and his worship will be proper, and we'll all get to come and visit God at his house someday. Even we who are living here in northern Indiana or wherever we're living at the time, and we get to go and travel to the land of Israel, to Jerusalem. But when we go, unlike when Hannah goes, when we get to go and we get to visit the Temple Mount, we don't get to see some dome on the rock, and we don't get to see some run-down old wall that people are kind of bowing down at and stuffing little papers in the cracks. Who do we get to visit when we go? Oh, yes. We get to visit the brand new temple. And this brand new temple is not only fancy and shiny, and we not only have the blueprints laid out for it, but there's somebody very special that lives there, because the inside of that thing is glowing. And do we know why it would be glowing? It is not because of LED lighting, okay? It is because the God of glory lives there, and that's where his throne is. And we get to visit God at his home. And again, I don't think we'll probably get to go in, we Gentiles probably don't get to go into the holy area because we are not permitted. And we'll get to that later, but we get to go visit God at his home, and that's exciting. Whew. Good stuff. Continuing on, chapter 44. More descriptions, and listen to some of these things that God kind of introduces. Chapter 44, verse 1, Then he brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces east, and it was shut. And the Lord said to me, This gate shall remain shut. It shall not be opened, and no one shall enter it. For the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered by it. Therefore, it shall remain, it shall remain shut. This would be God's personal gate. You don't get to use it. Okay, God has come through here. Now it is shut. This is not your gate. You come in the side door. Verse 3, Only the prince may sit in it to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by the way of the vestibule gate, and shall go out by the same way. Then he brought me by way of the north gate to the front of the temple, and I looked, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple of the Lord, and I fell on my face. And the Lord said to me, Son of man, mark well, see with your eyes, and hear with your ears all that I shall tell you concerning the statutes of the temple of the Lord and all its laws. Listen up, write this down. Again, get your voice recorder and everything you need. Write down every detail, because I'm going to start giving you the laws of conduct within my temple that I just described to you. Okay? You ready for the laws? And we're not going to read all of them, don't worry. Just a select few. Skip down to verse 9. Thus says the Lord, No foreigner, uncircumcised in heart and flesh, of all the foreigners who are among the people of Israel, shall enter my sanctuary. That's an interesting verse, is it not? No foreigners from the people of Israel get to come into my sanctuary. Nobody who is uncircumcised of heart. Paul talks about being uncircumcised of heart, right? You're not following God and you're not dedicated to him. But it doesn't say just of heart here, does it? It reinstitutes something else. Nobody who is uncircumcised in heart and, what's the next word? Again, this sounds familiar. I thought that kind of thing had been disbanded in the New Testament era. But what does God require of people who come into his sanctuary in his home? They must be circumcised. When did we see this before? Also, again, back in the Old Testament times under Jewish law. So he's reinstituting something else here, is he not? Continuing on, verse 10, But the Levites who went far away from me, going astray from me after their idols when Israel went astray, shall bear their punishment. These Levites, who I had instituted in the first giving of the law under Moses, I had made them my temple workers, and they could do, all the temple-y stuff there. But when Israel went astray, they were leading the pack away, and they were making the people, or they were not making the people, they were leading the people into their sin and their idolatry. These people were supposed to be bringing the people to me, or actually leading them away from me. And again, you remember in Ezekiel, when God looks at the shepherds of his people and said, You over-shepherds, you're supposed to be helping my sheep, but instead you are... Think about it. You don't have to say it out loud. That's fine. You are leading my sheep away. You're not being good shepherds. You're not bringing them to me. You're not feeding them with the spiritual stuff that I gave you to feed them with. You're leading them away. You're encouraging the idolatry. You're helping set up these idols in my temple. You're no good, you Levites. You were leading the pack, and you were more harm than you were good. So these people, he says, shall bear their punishment. They shall be ministers in my sanctuary at that time, having oversight at the gates of the temple and ministering in the temple. They shall slaughter the burnt offering and the sacrifices for the people, and they shall stand before the people to minister to them. Because they ministered to them before their idols, though, and became a stumbling block of iniquity to the house of Israel, therefore I have sworn concerning them, declares the Lord God, that they shall bear their punishment. They shall not come near to me, nor serve me as priests, nor come near any of my holy things and the things that are most holy, but they shall bear their shame and the abominations that they have committed. Yet I will appoint them to keep charge of the temple, and do all of its service and all that is to be done in it. So God says we have a little punishment to carry out here. Originally, the Levites had all various and sundry jobs in the temple, and they could do a whole bunch of stuff. But they deserted me at the time when I needed them most. And when Israel was turning away, they were leading the pack. And so I will allow them to serve in the sanctuary. However, they have to bear their punishment. And they don't get to come near me. They get to do the menial jobs. So two things we've seen so far here in chapter 44. We see no uncircumcised in the sanctuary, which kind of reverts back to the old Jewish system. Number two, the Levites, the generalized Levites, get only to serve in what I will call non-leadership assistant positions. They get the odd jobs of cleaning up. They get to serve and help the people. They get to slaughter animals. They get to do kind of the dirty work, but they don't get to actually come near me, God says, because they deserted me when I needed them the most. I put them in this place to lead the people, and they led them away instead to me. And so because of that, they cannot come near me the way that they used to. Point number 3, pick it up in verse 15. But the Levitical priest, the sons of Zadok, who kept the charge of my sanctuary when the people of Israel went away from me, shall come near to minister to me, and stand before me to offer me the fat and the blood, declares the Lord. They shall enter my sanctuary, and they shall approach my table to minister to me, and they shall keep my charge. When they enter the gates of the inner court, they shall wear, and pay attention to this, see if this sounds familiar, they shall wear linen garments. They shall have nothing of wool on them, while they minister at the gates of the inner court and within. And they shall have linen turbans on their heads, and linen undergarments around their waist. And they shall not bind themselves with anything that causes sweat. No cotton, no polyester, no rayon, no spandex. They are wearing linen, right down to the underwear. Okay? That's what it says. Verse 19, and when they go out to the outer court to the people, they shall put off the garments in which they have been ministering and lay them in the holy chambers. And they shall put on other garments, lest they transmit holiness to the people with their garments. And they shall not shave their heads or let their locks grow long. They shall surely trim the hair of their head. In other words, no sign of mourning or unkeptness in God's presence. Verse 21, no priest shall drink wine when he enters the inner court. They shall not marry a widow or a divorced woman, but only of the virgins of the offspring of the house of Israel, or a widow who's the widow of a priest. They shall teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between the clean and the unclean. Are you picking this up? Does this sound familiar to anybody? This sounds unbelievably reminiscent of what? The Old Testament Mosaic law. And God is reinstituting all of these things in his kingdom when he returns someday. He continues on talking about the different priestly functions. They'll act as judges, and they can do this and not that. I won't read all of it to you. But he continues on, and all these things sound very, very, very much like what God had instituted originally in the original Old Testament law. And it's fascinating. In fact, as you go through what we've seen this week, and then to give you a sneak peek of next week, look at all these things he's reinstituted so far. He's reinstituted the temple. He's rebuilt it. He's reinstituted the priesthood by specifically declaring who does and who does not get to do what. He will, in next week's lesson, reinstitute the allocation of the land, just like he did back in the time of Joshua. You tribe get this land, and you tribe get that land, and you tribe get that land, and my temple goes here, all that kind of thing. He reinstitutes the king and the monarchy. I will be the king, so-and-so will be the prince, other people get to rule here and there. He has reinstituted circumcision, as we already read here earlier in the passage today. All these things he is reinstituting Old Testament law in his land and in his kingdom. And again, I spent some time thinking about this as I was reading through this, and I'm debating with myself how much I want to say right now, because I should probably study it more, and I don't want to say things that are not quite right. But if you want to bicker about it later after class, we can do that, because that'd be super fun. But it's fascinating to me how many of the Old Testament things that we in our day consider gone and obsolete, no longer in use, at the end times, when God comes back and he regathers his people, all these things start to come back again. And as we read through and remember other parts of Scripture, how in the Old Testament times God worked through his people Israel, and God's plan was to be their God, and they were to be God's representatives on earth. And he set up this system where God is seen as holy through the worship and the behavior of the people, but God is separated from the people because he's in the Holy of Holies, and only certain people can go in to approach him. All those things are reinstituted at this time. And we think of our, how do I want to say this without going out on a limb I don't want to go out onto. We think of our New Testament times and practices as having replaced the Old Testament times and practices. In other words, God is done with all that stuff because now Christ has come, and now we are the church age, and now we don't do the sacrifices, we don't do the priests because we have our high priest, and we don't do the temple because we can worship anywhere, and all these different things where we do things in our New Testament-y way because we've outgrown the Old Testament and all those laws, and those are no longer useful. In fact, Paul even talks about in I know the passage right now, and it slipped my mind. Anyway, it talks about in Galatians and Hebrews and Romans. I can't remember which one says which. But he says those old ways have become obsolete. Those were our schoolmaster to lead us to Christ, but now they're done. We don't need them anymore because now we have the real thing. And Hebrews talks about how the Old Testament sacrificial system and the priests and all that, those are things that pointed to Christ, but now it's gone, and we don't need him anymore. And yet, at the end of time, when he comes back and resets up his rule and reign in Jerusalem, do you know what he brings back? And so our new way of doing things is not, there was that, and now we do things our way forevermore. Our New Testament way of doing things seems to me, and we can talk about this later if you want, to be kind of the bubble, the parentheses of time in which we do things. God has set aside temporarily his Jewish plan. Now he's working with the Gentiles, but someday he will be, I don't want to say done with the Gentiles because he always loves salvation, all this stuff. But his focus will return to his people Israel. And at that time, he will reset up his Israeli, Jewishy way of doing things that he instituted. So the way we live now is kind of a bloop in the middle of the two Jewish sections, which are God's overreaching plans. In fact, I want to read to you just a few verses out of Romans chapter 11 quickly that kind of describe this. And again, this is not something it might surprise us because we're not used to hearing it, but this is absolutely God's plan. Romans chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, and then we'll skip a few verses because of time, and we'll go to verse 25. But Romans chapter 11, verse 11. So I ask, did they being the Jewish people, the Israelites, did they stumble in order that they might fall? In other words, have they messed up so bad that God is just done with them and he's getting rid of them? By no means, says Paul. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Why did God offer salvation to the Gentiles apart from the Jewish law? According to this passage, why did he? He grants us salvation in the way that he did so that his people will look at us and say, hey, that's supposed to be our God. Give him back, right? To make them just. He's granting us our salvation in our way, not only because he loves us, but also to work in his own people. Continuing on. Verse 12, now if their trespass, Israel's mess-ups, mean riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, in other words, because they messed up and rebelled, God offers this to us, how much more will their fullness, inclusion, mean? How much better will it be when they return to me and God can work through his people again for the benefit of the Gentile as well? Skip on down to verse 25. Lest you be wise in your own sight, lest you think too highly of yourselves, Gentiles, and think, you Jewish people messed up, now he's our God. Not yours. I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until, what does until mean? That means there is a stopping point. Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, a deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards to the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but as regards to election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Just as you were at one time disobedient to God, he's talking to the Gentiles here, but have now received mercy because of the Israelites' disobedience. Because they disobeyed, God is granting you this salvation in this way. Verse 31, so they too have now been disobedient in order that by mercy shown to you they may also now receive mercy. They can look at you, see salvation, and receive it for themselves as well. Verse 32, for God has consigned all to disobedience that he might have mercy on all. Oh, the depths of the rich and the riches and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. And it goes on to praise God there throughout the rest of the passage. But he says, God has set aside Israel for the moment and given mercy to the Gentiles in this way so that he can work in the hearts of his Jewish people. But until the fullness of the Gentiles is done, and then he turns his attention back to Israel. And it's fascinating to see how all that plays out in the book of Ezekiel, when someday God comes back and sets up his kingdom and reinstitute all these things that we think of as the Old Testament way, and yet here they are showing up again in the New Testament future times. We'll talk more about that next week, but we got to split because the time is against us. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you again for all these things we can learn from your word, things that you tell us about the future times, how unbelievable your plans are. And we tend to be small-sighted and narrow-minded sometimes in the way that we see things, and yet your overarching plan is more amazing than we can comprehend. You work with the Jews to benefit us, and then you set them aside and work with us to benefit the Jews, and someday you work with the Jews again to benefit us, and it's all in your plan. You predicted it all, clear back to the books of Moses and beyond. Your plans, what can we say? They're amazing, and they're unstoppable, and they're sovereign, and we're so thankful for them all because we know that through them you love us and you want to save us from our sins to reconcile us to yourself because you want to come and live with people again. And someday we look forward to coming and visiting you in your home in Jerusalem, and we just can't wait. Thank you for all these things you've done for us. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.